talking a bit more further about marketplaces, I would like to invite onto the stage Angela De Giacomo. She is managing the Bizel Family Office. Please give it up for Angela, ladies and gentlemen. And on this panel, Sino Consulting, the name of his company is the name of the person himself, Martin Burger, ladies and gentlemen. There he is, give it up for Martin. And our third panelists that we're going to talk to is Akshay of BD Diaspora, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. So, how to marketplaces in Europe and in Asia. And it's a very wide topic, of course. So what I would like to suggest is that we combine like insights with very practical tips, because in the end we have a mixture of people representing an ecosystem, so they just want to know what is happening in other ecosystems, but we also have entrepreneurs, so those are the ones that just want to know, okay, how am I going to do stuff in a different part of the world? But first, Angela, could you explain a bit the background of the Bizel family in India, because they're really much into marketplaces, right?
I see some Indian faces in the audience, so I would like to ask the audience, who of you knows Fab India? Okay, so then I'll ask him, would you mind describing what Fab India does? Yes, because I work for the owners, they are called the Bizels. So, and for the ones who don't know Fab India, maybe a few words?
Sure, Fab, as a consumer, Fab India is a chain of stores. I think calling it chain does disservice to how elegantly it's been designed, but it's a chain of stores with Indian clothing for men and women and a few indigenous products of art and culture.
Yeah, so it's always better to hear what others say about Fab India rather than saying it myself, because I'm of course very biased. I would say Fab India is one of the most iconic brands in India, and I have the privilege to work with the owners of Fab India since 2013, and my role there is to manage their personal wealth. And whenever I am in Delhi, which is 6 months a year roughly, I work out of the head office, and it's fascinating because they are very much a physical store business. They have ventured into the online space, but at their core belief is that consumers should come into a physical store, and that's why I'm very happy to be on this panel to give some Indian flavor, but also some offline flavor of the Indian consumer market.
And I would advise you to Google Angela after this panel, because she was recently interviewed by a couple of German newspapers, and to put them through Google Translate. Actually, it's a very nice personal story. One of the things that struck me most is that you were very young when you went to India, right? It was just a backpacker's adventure a long time ago.
Well, now I'm feeling very old, but you're right. So I went to India in 1998. For the first time, so that's been more than 20 years. I was 17 at that time, and I was on a discovery search, backpacking, and at that point of time I decided that later in my career I would like to work in India. And yeah, 15 years later it so happened.
And now managing the family offices of one of the richest families in India, so great.
Well, I would
kudos.
like to remark that.
Why?
They are rich, but not one of the richest. So, but we come to that when it comes to e-commerce and marketplaces, because what Reliance and Jio and Mukesh Ambani and some of the likes have announced is quite interesting.
Okay. Martin, you do consulting. Why?
Because I've been involved with China since I was 15. I went there when I was 17, the first time, and worked in China quite a while. And I realized that Germans doing business in China, they lose many opportunities. And
now you put it very politely, probably, or not?
Um, well, there are things you can do in China, there are things you can't do in China, and some of the things you can do, I think you should do, maybe. And if no one explains to you how to cope, how to develop your business in China, you'll just, sometimes you also lose your business partners and things like that, because culture and the way to do business, like many Chinese, they're a bit annoyed by the German way of being slow and not flexible. And so this is why I thought there needs to be someone who helps German businesses to improve.
Yeah, and also particularly in the marketplaces sphere, or consulting in general?
Yes. Well, when you called in the panel, I was thinking about, well, marketplaces. This is such a huge topic. Could be a trade fair, could be anything. But I was thinking about the recent developments, like digital marketplaces, which are so advanced in China, and especially for people in Europe. We are not so much used in using digital solutions compared to the Chinese. And also what is happening in China right now, the B2C market is growing so fast, so you have a very fastly growing middle class. Yeah, we help businesses to survive in that area.
Very interesting. Akshay, could you share something about your experience with marketplaces and?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here because and follow Samar, because I actually helped launch Uber in India in the early days in 2013. So it was awesome to hear Samar's story.
You almost made him go bankrupt.
No, we have a lot of respect for.
They're still doing it. Okay.
I don't work at Uber anymore.
Okay, good for you.
So,
Yeah.
now I run a fund come growth initiative for companies that are being built in emerging markets such as India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, to enable them to go global. And so we think that especially marketplaces are global products from day one, and that with the appropriate support and infrastructure, we can take these companies global. So that's my background.
Yeah, but super interesting, because why would you say so, that a marketplace, every marketplace is global from day one?
Well, because marketplaces by its character are enabling transactions between a supply side and a supplier and a consumer, and you're likely to have that characteristic feature anywhere around the world. It just requires us to, the peculiarities are really around regulation, pricing, things like this, that we think we can enable with appropriate infrastructure to decode, and that will enable companies to go faster. For instance, like Uber's expansion was way early in its traditional life cycle as a company, right? I think in 3 years into, the first 1 year Uber was only in San Francisco. The second year Uber was in San Francisco and New York. And then the third year was when Uber went global to about 33 cities. And so the idea there was to get the product market, the product template right for launch, and go global. I think thinking global early on in the life cycle enables that to happen, and hopefully that we can do that.
Yeah. Angela, what did you see working with the family when they went from offline to online? What were their experiences that they had during that time?
Well, it's a difficult question because I'm not working on the corporate level of Fabindia. So, and as I initially said, it's very much a retail player. So physical retail stores, they have more than 300 stores. And I think in India, they're doing something which is really counterintuitive, because they're opening experience centers, which you can imagine are big flagship stores, where they offer the consumer all the experiences they can imagine. So they're actually doing something very counterintuitive when reading all the big numbers. what I hear from China as well and India all the time is that there is this growing middle class, and it's usually a 3-digit number. It usually is around 2, 3, 4, sometimes I hear even 500 million consumers who are entering into that space, and I think there is a huge difference between China and India, because in India what I see is there is a pyramid of consumers, and I'll explain that because it gives you a flavor of why Fab India is doing it the way they're doing it. So the pyramid is probably 550 million Indians who are below the poverty line in terms of their purchasing power. And then there are around 380 million plus who are having an average income on an annual basis, which is $7,500 to probably $35,000 US. You can do the math, how much you're earning and how much that translates in India. And there are 20 million, that's the number I have read recently in a report from NESCOM and PwC, which is Indians who are affluent, who have an average income of more than $35,000 US. So Fab India sells pieces which are usually sold at the affluent bracket. So for them, targeting to a mass market is not their main
Objective.
driver.
Yeah.
So that's why they're focusing very much on experiences in retail stores and building this India story.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's on India. On Fab India, if you wanted to know other things about India in the market space, I think probably he's more interesting to be asked. Otherwise, there is startup experience that we're having because we are investing in startups where, again, we have a different experience.
Okay. Yeah, so please share.
Well, we are invested in a fashion company, for example, where we can see that teenagers who are in the age range from 16 to 24 are very much a different customer group, where we can see that they are mobile first. So another number that I want to share whenever it comes to India middle class is there are 450 million users of internet and mobile phones, but the number that I read is it's only 70 million who are using the internet for more than 3 to 4 years. So I think that puts certain geographics and demographics into perspective, because we're always talking about gigantic numbers of people using the phones. But yeah, so one other startup we are invested in is called, I won't say who they are, but they're into voice recognition, because what I find interesting about e-commerce and marketplaces is the industry and the ecosystem that is created around that. So in India, there are a lot of people who don't speak English, which is something that we think is very natural, but they have so many languages that if you can actually translate whatever Indian language into a voice recognition app, and this voice recognition app speaks to an e-commerce player like a Flipkart, which is the pendant of Amazon, then you allow people to consume even in remoter areas where the purchasing power is lower, but they don't even know English, but they can start shopping. So again, guy in the first row said that there are some ethical questions raised about that, but that's what I like about the ecosystem, that it's bringing up such ideas.
Yeah, great. So we've heard about, okay, from day one you have to think global, mobile, of course, untapped markets, like also within China, of course, very different regions, different languages, different kind of habits. Is this also what you were talking about when you talk about opportunities that are often overlooked?
Well, talking about the online platforms or marketplaces, you mentioned one aspect, offline business. And in India, I'm not so sure about Indian markets, but I'm not very familiar with India. But what I see in China, what I think is happening in China, and also very interesting for the European markets, is that the service providers, such as Alibaba, for example, they provide solutions that connect the offline and online world. So you have offline stores that actually provide services that you would get in online marketplaces, or they provide infrastructure, digital infrastructure, payment, data analytic tools to offline stores. This is very interesting. But talking about the opportunities, if you are familiar with the Chinese market, you know that for European businesses, it's difficult to enter the Chinese market, also legally, because before, when you wanted to do B2C in China, you had to have a legal entity there. You couldn't sell, you couldn't write invoices to Chinese clients without being there. Yeah. But you can do that now through e-commerce platforms.
Yeah, yes. By being part of their ecosystem.
Yes, yeah. Yes. So you can open online stores and sell just as you're used to from here.
Yeah. Yeah, well, later on we're going to hear Marcel Munk. Are you here, Marcel? No, he's giving a workshop somewhere else. Also on this topic, for example, having an app on WeChat. Or yesterday we learned that over 1 million apps are active on WeChat. So.
Yes, but it's a very new development because Chinese government is also encouraging the e-commerce
trend.
Trend, you could call it like that. Yeah. And they realized that many companies that wanted to enter the Chinese market and that wanted to participate, they actually couldn't because some of them are too small maybe.
Yeah. Super interesting. Actually, what products from countries that you were talking about do now have a strong presence in, for example, Germany or in Europe? Which products have gained some traction? Can you mention some examples, marketplaces?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the most iconic example is GoEuro, which is now called Omio. And it's kind of, taking a step back a little bit more, in terms of products, I think the reason we're super bullish about Europe and Berlin in particular is because we think that once this bull market calms down and this overemphasis on growth kind of morphs into an emphasis on revenue, Europe is just the best place to be in because there's 500 million people here with a per capita GDP of 35,000 euros. It's an incredibly, it seems like it's a fragmented market on the outside because of the cultural and language differences, but there's a lot of pan-European regulation that allows you to do business out of being here in Berlin, which in many ways is kind of like the cultural capital, English-speaking capital of Europe. And so we just think that there's an opportunity to come and build a pan-European or global business out of here. And if you look at, so I lived in San Francisco before I moved here, and in many ways, Berlin reminds you a little bit of that San Francisco-esque feel, but without all the money, right? Because San Francisco, because, and that's a good thing. Hang on, that's a good thing. Well, because there's of course gentrification here, but if you look at the peak of what gentrification looks like, everybody's wearing Patagonia jackets and yoga pants and going to work. It's the worst. It's not the good part of San Francisco. But there's like a huge art and music community here. There's a bunch of anti-establishment culture embedded into the system, which is kind of what you need if you want to build a startup, because it's kind of it's not everybody you need the network effects of enough people who don't want to do a 9-to-5 job to be in the same physical space, which you have in Berlin. And so it's super kind of exciting in that sense. In terms of products, I just think that there's a large number of services-based products. We're investing in about 10 of them by the end of June this year. Super early stage companies that we're bringing both from India at the moment and surrounding, let's say, regions in Europe.
Yeah, because you mentioned GoEuro, and of course it has been built by the way, a solo entrepreneur, which is really something special because usually we talk about teams, but Naren really built this himself, literally off the ground. But it's not a product that you know he started the business here, right? He built the product here, so it's not something that was started in, for example, India or Indonesia and then was brought to Germany or to Europe.
Yeah, sure. I think that incidentally, Naren, who's the co-founder of, the founder of Go Euro, and I grew up in the same city, and he just landed cold in Berlin 7 years ago and started this business, which is amazing. And I think that's the spirit you need in emerging markets, which I think we have a cultural barrier of, because there's a ambition ceiling because of the kind of themes that Angela talked about, which was, oh, there's 500 million people or there's 1 billion people in India, there's 1 billion opportunities, and so you should build for India. Well, it turns out that the addressable market is a lot smaller than that, and it makes sense for you to go global about a year before you start to go into towns and cities where your product may not be used. And that's why I have a lot of respect for what Jugnu has done in the context of a hyper-funded environment, into taking their business global into some of the cities that into some of the cities that made more sense globally than in India.
Yeah. Okay, so what were your own thoughts before going on the panel? What did you think? Okay, this is my key message. This is really something that I have to share if people are interested in marketplaces and the Asia Pacific region or in Europe. What were your own thoughts on that and your learnings after so many years of experience in this field? What is the number one thing that people really have to understand if they want to do something with marketplaces in those regions?
Should I go first? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. Whoever wants to.
Okay, I would just say two things. One is that you have to get comfortable with throwing people at the problem, not technology always, and that just means reinventing being super agile operationally. So, for example, drivers onboarded in India came to an office place as opposed to just opening up their smartphone, which they didn't have, and just signing up. And so we had a huge marriage conventional halls that were taken.
In beginning of Uber India, you mean? Okay.
Yes. In our first day of Uber, when we launched in India, we onboarded them in a marriage convocation hall. So that's kind of like you have to get comfortable with that operational effort, even though it's a tech company.
They signed paper.
Well, they would come and push a button on a smartphone we offered them, but yes.
Okay.
And you'd have 100 drivers gathered, and we would manually enter all their details, and it's not scalable, and so you have to be prepared for the operational burnout on some of that in the short term. And the second thing is, I think every business has an addressable market that's not necessarily geographic. And what I mean by that is, whenever companies think of expansion, they think of expansion into the next city, right? Or the next country. But those are arbitrary geographic boundaries. And so to think about expansion in the way of saying, if, as an example for Uber, it's like the city center, right? How many city centers can we launch in that are large enough? And if there are only 6 city centers in a country like India, and the 7th city center is outside of India, in Indonesia, then you're better off going to Indonesia than launching the 7th city that doesn't have the network effects of a city center yet.
Yeah, when I think about marketplaces, then of course I think of a place where people meet and someone wants to sell and someone wants to buy, and ideally they find a price where they can do that. But what I like about marketplaces when I think about Asia is that it has such a transformative power. And I like to think about marketplaces along with the ecosystem that comes with it. There is no way you can do an online marketplace in e-commerce if you don't have online payments. And the Reserve Bank of India, for example, did a big step in the early 2000s to allow that, which means that in a cash-paying country like India, it's not the same like in China, but I don't know so much, but in India you can still pay with cash. If you have an e-commerce store, then still 50-60% is cash on delivery. So getting the government to allow and provide a platform where you can do online payments is big. Paytm is one of the bigger players where they allow online payments. So it starts with that, then comes trust, then comes the actual selling transaction, as I said, then there comes voice recognition, there comes big data analytics, there comes advertisement. So everything that is built around that, targeting customers you couldn't approach earlier, even with products you couldn't approach them earlier, changes the whole ecosystem. And in Asia, what I find fascinating is that it transforms whole societies.
Cool. Some practical information. What kind of investments are you looking for?
Well, at the moment we have morphed from being very tech-centric, analytics and so forth, software companies into the consumer space. So we are very much back to physical products. So our last investment was done in a company called Wamomo, physical product, eatable, very nice. So we like consumer space at the moment.
Okay. Main lesson to share with our audience.
Well, talking about China, I think, first of all, do your homework, know your target customer group, for example, and also what you want to reach. And then from that, define or look out which platform, which marketplace could help you to reach your goals. One very nice example also that China is different to Europe is Aldi. They're investing in China right now with a completely different approach to what they're doing in other markets. Usually Aldi would open thousands of stores and then later open up an e-commerce channel. They do the other way around. In China, they first open up their e-commerce channel on Tmall, collect data on their target group, on their clients, and then decide on where to open an Aldi market. A physical Aldi market. So I think that's most important.
Okay. If people now are, are you looking for German entrepreneurs expanding to the Chinese market, or Chinese people wanting to do something in Germany, or do you do both? Or
We do both, but we do Germans more.
okay.
Because we know more about the Chinese market than about the German market. It's very simple.
Okay. Thank you so much. Give it up, ladies and gentlemen. Big applause for our panelists.